The cold bite of metal restraints against her wrists was the first thing Silaren noticed as consciousness crept back. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and the sterile scent of human technology filled her nostrils, a sharp, chemical smell that made her stomach clench with revulsion. The detention cell was smaller than she'd expected, barely 3 meters by 3, with walls of reinforced steel that hummed with an electric current designed to discourage escape attempts. She tested the restraints carefully, her violet toned, fingers exploring the edges of the cuffs. The metal was warm against her skin, indicating some kind of monitoring system. Her purple curls fell across her face as she examined her surroundings, noting the single cot, a basic hygiene station, and a food slot in the door. Everything was utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort. The mission had failed spectacularly. She could still hear the echoes of plasma fire, still feel the moment when the stun blast had dropped her to her knees, just meters from the human outpost's communication array. Her squad was either dead or captured. She had no way of knowing which fate would be worse. Heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond her cell, accompanied by rough human voices. Silaren straightened, drawing on years of military training. To compose herself, the Avenari had taught her that humans were unpredictable creatures, driven by emotion rather than logic, capable of sudden violence or inexplicable mercy. She would not show weakness to these conquerors. New prisoners awake, one voice was saying as the footsteps approached. Commander wants her processed by morning. Yeah, well, the commander can want all he likes, another voice replied, this one lower, calmer. She's not going anywhere tonight. The cell door's viewing slot slid open with a metallic scrape. Silaren found herself staring into brown eyes that were surprisingly gentle for a human's. The face belonged to a man, perhaps 30 human years. Old, with weathered features and a small scar running along his left temple. Unlike the other guards she'd glimpsed during her brief conscious moments after capture, this one wasn't leering at her or making threatening gestures. You hungry? He asked simply. The question caught her off guard. She had expected interrogation, perhaps torture, certainly the kind of brutal efficiency her people had warned her about regarding human captors. Food was not part of that equation. I asked if you were hungry, the human repeated, his voice carrying neither impatience nor mockery. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Your metabolism probably needs fuel. Silaren studied his face, searching for the deception that must be hidden there. Among the Avenari, every gesture had meaning. Every word carried weight. But this human's expression remained neutral, almost tired. Why? She finally asked, her voice hoarse from the stun weapon's aftereffects. Because hunger makes thinking harder, he replied. And you're going to need to think clearly in the days ahead. The viewing slot closed, but she could hear him speaking to someone else in the corridor. Minutes later, the food slot opened and a tray slid through, nothing elaborate, but warm and filling. Real food, not the nutrient paste she'd expected. She didn't touch it at first, suspicion warring with genuine hunger. But as the hours passed and no ill effects manifested, she began to eat slowly, trying to process this unexpected kindness. Later that night, during what she assumed was a shift change, the same human appeared at her door again. This time, he didn't speak, just checked the environmental controls and made some adjustments that brought the cell's temperature to a more comfortable level. The heating had been set for human comfort, not Avenari physiology, but somehow he had known to adjust it. What is your name? She called out as he prepared to leave. He paused, considering. Elias Ward, he said finally. Security detail. Why? Are you being kind to me, Elias Ward? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she didn't understand. Because kindness costs nothing, he said. And we've all got enough darkness too. carry without adding more. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Silaran found herself staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile everything she'd been taught about humans with the quiet man who had just fed her and warmed her cell without asking for anything in return. Perhaps the enemy was more complex than her people had believed. 3 days had passed since Silaran's capture, and the routine had become strangely comforting. Elias Ward appeared at her cell 3 times each day, morning, afternoon, and during the quiet hours of the night shift when the base settled into an uneasy stillness. He never lingered long, never pressed for information, but his presence had become the one constant in her confined world. During the day, other guards would patrol the detention block. Jackson, a thick-set man with cruel eyes, would bang his baton against her door and mutter threats about what would happen when Commander Briggs got tired of waiting for intelligence. Torres, younger but no less hostile, would peer through the viewing slot and make crude comments about Avenari anatomy that made Silaran's skin crawl. But Elias was different. When he brought her meals, he would sometimes pause to ask if the temperature was comfortable, if she needed additional blankets, if the lighting was too harsh for her eyes. Small considerations that spoke of a mind that saw her as more than just an enemy prisoner. "You were a soldier," she said one evening as he made his rounds. It wasn't a question. She could see it in the way he moved, the careful economy of motion that came from years of military discipline. He paused at her door, considering whether to respond. "Infantry," he said finally. 3 tours on the outer rim before they pulled me back. "Why are you no longer fighting?" His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his temple. "Because I'd seen enough." There was a weight to his words that Silaran recognized. Among her own people, warriors who had endured too much battle carried that same exhaustion, the hollow look of those who had stared too long into the void of war. "The Avenari taught us that humans feel no remorse for violence," she said carefully, "that you are driven by conquest and dominance." Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe some are, but the rest of us just try to survive it." The next day brought an unexpected gift. Along with her morning meal, Elias slid a small data pad through the food slot. The screen displayed what appeared to be human literature, poetry, stories, historical accounts. "Thought you might want something to occupy your mind," he said when she looked up in surprise. Silaran spent hours reading, fascinated by the glimpses into human culture. Their art spoke of longing, of loss, of hope, persisting in the face of darkness. It was nothing like the propaganda she'd been fed about human nature. When Elias returned that evening, she was ready with questions. "This poem about the soldier returning home," she said, holding up the pad. "He speaks of dreams that haunt him. Do all human warriors suffer from their memories?" "Most of us," Elias admitted, settling into a more comfortable position outside her cell. For the first time, he seemed willing to have an actual conversation. "The lucky ones find ways to make peace with what they've done. And the unlucky ones? They end up working security detail on forgotten outposts, trying to convince themselves they're protecting something that matters." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten. She found herself studying his face through the narrow gap in the door, noting the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself. "Tell me about Avenari culture," he said, surprising her with the request. "What's it like growing up among your people?" She hesitated, then began to speak of her homeworld, the crystal spires that sang in the wind, the meditation gardens where young Avenari learned to center their minds, the complex honor codes that governed every aspect of their society. As she talked, she watched his expression, seeing genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment she'd expected. "It sounds beautiful," he said when she finished. It was. "Before the war." "Before we came, you mean?" Silarin met his eyes before we both chose to follow orders that led us here. That night, she heard raised voices in the corridor. Commander Briggs arguing with someone about interrogation protocols and the need for actionable intelligence. Elias's voice, calm but firm, responding that the prisoner was cooperating within acceptable parameters. Hours later, when the base had quieted, she heard footsteps approach her cell. But instead of the usual routine check, Elias spoke through the door. "Briggs is pushing for more aggressive questioning," he said quietly. "I've been covering for you, saying you're providing information. But that won't hold him off much longer." "Why are you protecting me?" Another long pause. "Because I've seen what those interrogations do to people. And because—" He stopped, seeming to wrestle with something. "Because what?" "Because when I look at you, I don't see an enemy. I see someone who got caught up in something bigger than both of us." The confession hung in the air between them. Silarin felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cell's heating system. "Elias," she said softly. "Yeah? Thank you." When she heard his footsteps retreating down the corridor, she pressed her hand against the cold metal of the door and wondered what was happening to her. 3 days ago, she had been a loyal Avenari warrior. Now she found herself counting the hours until she would hear his voice again, looking forward to conversations with a human who saw her as more than just an alien threat. The enemy, it seemed, had a face, and against all logic, against all her training, she was beginning to care what happened to that face. 2 weeks had passed since Silaren's capture, and the delicate balance Elias had maintained was beginning to crumble. Commander Briggs had grown increasingly suspicious of the lack of intelligence being extracted from their alien prisoner, and the other guards had started making pointed comments about Elias's soft approach to security. But none of that mattered during the quiet hours after midnight, when the base settled into its deepest sleep and Elias would position himself outside her cell for the long watch. Those conversations had become the highlight of both their existences, though neither would admit it aloud. "Tell me about your scar," Silaran said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. She had taken to pressing herself against the door. During their talks, as close as the barrier would allow, Elias unconsciously touched his temple. "Shrapnel from an IED on Proxima Station. 3 of my squad didn't make it out. You blame yourself. I was squad leader. It was my job to keep them safe. And yet you survived. That must carry its own burden." He was quiet for a long moment. "How did you know that?" "Because I see it in your eyes. The same look my brother had after the massacre of Vale Nebula. He led a reconnaissance mission that walked into a human ambush. Only 2 of them came back. Is he still fighting?" Silarin's throat tightened. "He took his own life 6 months later. The shame was too much for him to bear." Elias pressed his palm against the door, as if he could somehow reach through and comfort her. "I'm sorry. War makes ghosts of us all," she replied, her own hand finding the same spot on her side of the barrier. Though inches of metal separated them, she could feel the warmth of his presence. Their conversations had evolved beyond mere exchanges of information. They spoke of dreams, of fears, of the people they had been before the war had claimed them. Silaran learned that Elias had once wanted to be a teacher, that he still wrote poetry in the margins of his duty reports. Elias discovered that she had been an artist before conscription, that she could paint with her fingertips using techniques that created images which seemed to move and breathe. "Show me," he said one night, and she laughed softly. "I have no materials. Here, use the condensation on the walls. Just ... something small." With careful movements, Silaran traced patterns in the moisture that had accumulated on her cell's surface. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, creating flowing lines that seemed to capture the essence of movement itself. When she finished, she had created the image of two figures reaching toward each other across an impossible distance. "It's beautiful," Elias breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "It's us," she said simply. The admission hung between them, heavy, with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. But that night, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer simply captor and prisoner. They were two souls who had found an unexpected connection in the darkness of Vok. The turning point came during the third week. Silaren had been experiencing painful muscle cramps, a side effect of prolonged confinement that her physiology wasn't designed to handle. When she mentioned it during one of their conversations, Elias disappeared for nearly an hour. He returned with a small medical kit and a determination that overrode all protocol. "I'm coming in," he said, his voice thick with decision. "You need treatment. Elias, you could be court-martialed. I don't care." The cell door opened for the first time since her imprisonment. Elias stepped inside, and Silaren got her first unobstructed view of the man who had become so important to her. He was taller than she had expected, lean but strong, with kind eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "May I?" he asked, indicating the medical supplies dot. She nodded, suddenly nervous. No human had ever touched her before, and she wasn't sure what to expect. But as Elias worked to ease the tension in her shoulders and back, his hands were gentle, respectful, healing rather than harmful. "Better?" he asked when he finished. "Much." She turned to face him, and suddenly they were very close, closer than the cell door had ever allowed. She could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his skin. "Silaren," he said softly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I know this is impossible," she whispered. "I know. But impossible or not." When he leaned closer, she didn't pull away. Their first kiss was tentative, almost afraid a brush of lips that sent electricity through both their bodies. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This is dangerous," Elias said, though. He made no move to step away. "Everything about this war is dangerous," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his scar with her fingertip. "At least this feels like living." He stayed with her until nearly dawn, and they talked about everything and nothing. Their hands intertwined, their bodies pressed close together on the narrow cot. For a few precious hours, they weren't human and Avenari, weren't enemies. They were simply two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos. But as the first light of dawn began to filter through the cell's small window, reality crashed back. Elias had to leave, had to return to his duties, had to pretend that nothing had changed between them. "Whatever happens," he said as he prepared to go, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the best thing to happen to me in years. And you," she replied, "have shown me that the universe still has room for kindness." After he left, Silaren lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. She was in love with a human effect that would be considered treason by her own people and likely result in severe punishment from his. But as she traced her lips with her fingertips, still able to taste his kiss, she found she didn't care about the consequences. For the first time since her capture, she had something worth fighting for that wasn't about war or duty or honor. She had love, fragile and impossible though it might be. The alarm that began wailing 3 hours later would test that love in ways neither of them could have imagined. The alarm's piercing wail cut through the pre-dawn, quiet like a blade. Silaren bolted upright on her cot, her heart racing as emergency lights bathed the detention block in harsh red. She could hear boots pounding in the corridors, voices shouting. Orders, the distinctive whine of weapons being powered up. "Contact bearing 270, someone yelled. "Multiple Avenari fighters inbound." A rescue mission. Her people had come for her. The realization should have filled her with relief, but instead she felt only a growing dread. In a few minutes, she would have to choose between the life she had known and the impossible love she had discovered. There would be no middle ground, no compromise that would satisfy both sides. Elias appeared at her cell door, his face grim and conflicted. Behind him, she could see other guards taking defensive positions, their weapons trained toward the outer walls of the facility. "They're coming for you," he said, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarms. "I know. Briggs wants to move you to the secure bunker, use you as leverage." A casual way he said it made her blood run cold. "As a human shield, you mean?" "Yeah." His jaw tightened. "I won't let that happen." Before she could respond, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Commander Briggs appeared with 2 armed guards, his face flushed with excitement and fury. "Ward, get the prisoner ready for transport. We're moving her to the command bunker immediately." "Sir, the prisoner is secure here. Don't question me, soldier. That alien is our only bargaining chip if this goes south." "Now move." Silaran watched the exchange with growing alarm. She could see the conflict playing out across Elias's features duty, warring with conscience. Protocol battling against the feelings he had developed for her. "Sir," Elias said carefully, "using prisoners as human shields violates what? The Geneva Convention doesn't apply to alien combatants, Ward. Now open that cell, or I'll have you relieved of duty." A moment stretched taut between them. Silaran could see Elias's hand hover near his sidearm, could see the exact instant when his decision crystallized. Instead of opening her cell, he stepped protectively in front of the door. "I can't do that, sir." Briggs's face went purple with rage. "You're relieving yourself of duty then, soldier. Jackson, Torres, arrest this man for insubordination and open that cell." What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of slow motion. As the guards moved to restrain Elias, he drew his weapon not to threaten his fellow soldiers, but to destroy the cell's locking mechanism. Sparks flew as the electronic lock fused into uselessness. "Run," he said to Silaran as the cell door swung open. "When the shooting starts, head for the maintenance tunnels. Sector 7 leads to the surface. I'm not leaving without you." "You have to." His words were cut off by the sound of explosions from the outer perimeter. The rescue mission had begun in earnest. Emergency lighting flickered as the base's power grid took damage, and through the small windows they could see the distinctive purple glow of Avinari plasma weapons. Briggs and his men were forced to take cover as debris rained down from above. In the chaos, Elias grabbed Silaran's hand and pulled her toward a maintenance hatch he had clearly scouted in advance. "This way," he said, leading her through a maze of service corridors that ran beneath the base's main structure. "There's an old bunker about 2 kilometers from here. We can wait out the fighting." They ran through the darkness, guided only by Elias's knowledge of the base layout and the occasional emergency light that still functioned. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew louder, the distinctive crack of human projectile weapons mixing with the hiss of Avinari energy beams. The bunker was exactly where Elias had said it would be, a relic from the early days of human colonization, built into a natural cave system and long since forgotten by most of the base personnel. As they sealed themselves inside, both breathing hard from their escape, the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. "You've ruined your career," Silaran said softly. "Your own people will consider you a traitor, and yours will execute you for consorting with the enemy," Elias replied. "I guess that makes us even." They looked at each other in the dim light of the bunker's single emergency lamp, and suddenly the impossibility of their situation struck them both as almost absurd. Here they were, 2 people from species that had been at war for decades, having just thrown away everything they had known for the sake of each other. "What do we do now?" she asked. Instead of answering with words, Elias crossed the small space between them and took her face in his hands. "We live," he said simply, and kissed her with all the desperate passion of someone who had just gambled everything on love. This time, there was no hesitation, no gentle exploration. They came together with the urgency of two people who had just cheated death, their bodies seeking comfort and connection in the face of an uncertain future. Silaren's hands mapped the planes of his chest as he traced the elegant curves of her violet skin, both of them marveling at the differences and similarities between their species. When they made love, it was with a tenderness that transcended, the physical two souls finally finding the completion they had been seeking in each other's arms. Afterward, they lay entwined on the bunker's narrow bed, listening to the distant sounds of battle and talking about futures that seemed both impossible and inevitable. "We can't go back," Elias said, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "No," she agreed, "but perhaps we can go forward. Together?" Together. The explosions outside were growing more distant now, suggesting that one side or the other was gaining the upper hand. Soon, they would have to decide what came next, where two people who belonged to neither side could possibly find a place. In the galaxy dot, but for now, in this small bubble of safety they had created, it was enough to hold each other and believe that love could somehow be stronger than war. Whether they were naive or brave would remain to be seen, but they had made their choice. They had chosen each other, and whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 months had passed since the night Elias and Silar had fled into the darkness together, and the neutral colony of Haven's Rest had become something neither of them had dared to hope for home. The settlement existed in the gray spaces, between human and Avenari territory, a collection of prefabricated structures and converted cargo containers where refugees, deserters, and those who simply refused to choose sides had gathered to build something new. It wasn't much to look at, but it represented freedom in a way that neither of their former lives had ever offered. Silaren stood at the window of their small shared quarters, watching the daily bustle of the colony's main thoroughfare. Humans and Avenari worked side by side in the market stalls, their children playing together in the dust between the buildings. It still amazed her how quickly the barriers between species could dissolve when survival depended on cooperation rather than conflict. The council meeting went well, Elias said as he entered, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest, feeling the familiar warmth and strength of his embrace. "They agreed to your proposal?" "Our proposal," he corrected, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "The testimonial broadcasts start next week. If we can get our story out to both sides, maybe we can show them there's another way." It had been Siloren's idea initially to use their unique perspective as former enemies turned lovers to advocate for peace. The war was going poorly for both sides, and there were growing voices calling for a negotiated settlement. Their story, broadcast across human and Avenari space, might provide the emotional catalyst needed to bring the combatants to the table. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, turning in his arms to study his face. "Once we go public, there's no taking it back. Both our peoples will know what we've done." "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied, his brown eyes steady and full of love. "We found something here that's worth sharing with the galaxy." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, still sometimes amazed that this gentle, wonderful man was hers. "I love you, Elias Ward." "And I love you, Silaren of the Avenari," he replied formally, then grinned. "Soon to be Silaren Ward, if you'll have me." The proposal had come 2 weeks earlier, delivered not with grand romantic gestures, but in the quiet moments after they had finished their daily work in the colony's hydroponics garden. Simple, honest, perfect like everything else about their relationship. "The ceremony preparations are nearly complete," she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. They had decided to blend traditions from both their cultures, creating something new that honored their respective heritages while celebrating their unity. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted, "but in the best possible way." The wedding was held at sunset 3 days later in the colony's central plaza with the entire community in attendance. Elder Korath, an ancient Avenari philosopher, who had arrived at Haven's Rest seeking peace in his final years, officiated alongside Pastor Williams, a human chaplain who had left his military post to minister to the colony's spiritual needs. Silarin wore a gown of flowing white fabric, decorated with the traditional purple spirals of Avenari blessing ceremonies, while Elias had chosen a simple but elegant human-style suit. As they exchanged vows, speaking of love that transcended species and hope that could bridge any divide, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. "By the authority vested in us by love itself," Elder Korath intoned, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "we pronounce you bound in the sight of all who value peace over war, understanding over hatred. You may kiss your wife, Pastor," Williams added with a smile. The kiss they shared was gentle, reverent, full of promises for the future they would build together. As the crowd erupted in cheers and celebration, Silarin felt a completeness she had never known was possible. The party that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing that blended the traditions of both species. Silarin found herself swept up in a human line dance, laughing as Elias tried to teach her the steps, while later they moved together to the hypnotic rhythms of an Avenari meditation song, their bodies finding perfect harmony in the ancient patterns. "I have something to tell you," she whispered in his ear as they swayed together in the moonlight. "What's that, Mrs. Ward?" The title sent a thrill through her, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "The colony's medical scanner confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a child." Elias went very still, his eyes searching her face. "A child? Our child?" "A hybrid," she said softly. "The first of his or her kind, as far as anyone knows. Are you ready to be the father of a completely new type of person?" His answer was a kiss that lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as tears of joy streamed down both their faces. When he finally set her down, his hands immediately moved to her still flat stomach, as if he could somehow sense the new life growing there. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Too early to tell, but healthy, according to Dr. Vance. The genetic compatibility is better than anyone expected. Our baby is going to grow up in a world where love matters more than species," Elias sighed wonderingly, "where being different is celebrated instead of feared." "If we can make it happen," Silarin replied. "The peace talks are still just a possibility. Then we'll make sure they happen," he said with the quiet determination she had fallen in love with. "Our child deserves to inherit something better than endless war." 6 months later, as Silarin sat in the colony's newly constructed communication center, preparing to broadcast their story to both human and Avenari worlds, she could feel their daughter moving restlessly in her womb. The doctors had confirmed it the week before a healthy baby girl who would be born in another few months, carrying the genetic gifts of both her parents' species. "Ready?" Elias asked, taking his position beside her in front of the cameras. Silarin nodded, placing her hand over his where it rested on her rounded belly. "Ready." As the broadcast began, as they told their story of love conquering hatred and hope overcoming despair, she felt their daughter settle into stillness, as if she too was listening to the tale of how her parents had defied the galaxy to find each other. The responses, when they came, were overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from both sides: soldiers tired of fighting, families torn apart by war, young people who dreamed of a future where species could coexist in peace. There were detractors, too, voices calling them traitors and worse. but they were drowned out by the growing chorus of those who saw in Elias and Silaran's love a beacon of possibility. 2 months later, the first formal peace talks in a generation began on a neutral station, with representatives from both governments sitting down to discuss terms. It wasn't their story alone that made it happen, but they had provided the spark that lit a fire of hope across the galaxy. As Silaran held their newborn daughter in her arms, a perfect blend of human and Avenari features, with her mother's violet-tinged skin and her father's warm brown eyes, she looked up at Elias and saw the future reflected in his face. "What should we call her?" he asked softly, gently stroking the baby's downy purple hair. "Hope," Silaran said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Outside their window, the twin suns of Haven's Rest were setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, construction crews were working on the colony's expansion new homes for the growing number of refugees and peace seekers who arrived each day. It wasn't the ending either of them had expected when they first met through the bars of a prison cell, but it was perfect in its own impossible way. They had taken the leap of faith that love demanded, and somehow, against all odds, they had learned to fly. The galaxy was changing, one heart at a time, and they had helped light the way.